Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 6F, Asymmetrical Integration, Why All Our Progress is Lopsided, by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 6 on integration. In the process of integration discussed in the other videos in this series, the key moment is the reframing of our beliefs. But which beliefs? Which judgments are we reframing? Strictly speaking, when we talk about integration, we should talk about the integration of judgments of each specific judgment. However, it's a natural tendency of human beings to think in terms of us as whole humans and how integrated a human is. Human beings are very inconsistent. We may have more integrated beliefs at one time than another, in one situation than another. That's why we talk about asymmetrical integration when it comes to applying integration to a person as a whole. The quality of our judgment can be very lopsided. We may have one kind of judgment about art, for example, another when it comes to religion, quite a different approach when it comes to science, and perhaps even a fourth one when it comes to politics. In these different scenarios, we may well compartmentalise. We may well have quite different standards that we tend to apply. Perhaps because we've practiced making better judgments in one situation rather than another. However, the adequacy of our judgments depends not just on specialisation, spending more time looking at one particular area than another. It also depends on synthesis, on our ability to see different areas in relation to each other. For that reason, our different judgments in different areas are never entirely separate from one another. They may be seen as similar to a towed boat. If you're towing a boat, then there's a bit of slack in the line. The boat that's following you, that's connected by a rope, will always follow to some extent, but it will follow its own independent course to a degree. It will eventually catch up with the place where you were previously. In a similar way, when we make judgments in one area, and those judgments have a certain adequacy, that's likely to eventually filter through and have some impression on another area. I'm going to suggest 3 different types of asymmetry of integration. There's a difference between types of integration, there's a difference between levels of integration, and even within those there are differences between objects of judgment or different contexts where integration takes place. The 3 different types of integration are detailed each in different videos in this series. Briefly, the integration of desire involves the merging of energies, the integration of meaning, mutual comprehensibility with different symbols, overcoming of incomprehension. The integration of belief involves the reframing of conflicting beliefs so that we can sort out what is mutually acceptable and what can be discarded. Asymmetrical integration, which emphasises the integration of belief, will probably be dependent on some temporary conditions which create a surge of energy. This is discussed in the video on temporary and long-term integration in this series, so many of us may experience this on a temporary basis, a moment of inspiration, or what Buddhists call jhana. However, it's possible that some people may experience this kind of integration for a rather longer period. In perhaps a rather naive way, they haven't really integrated their beliefs, or indeed their meanings very much. Let's take the example of Joan of Arc. She's an astonishing figure, a teenage girl who managed to inspire the entire armies of France to victory against the English. One can only assume that she had an enormous access to the integration of desire, which other people were inspired by. Asymmetrical access to the integration of meaning at the expense of the other types, it's probably more likely to be associated with artistic creativity or similar kinds of inspiration. One good example of this might be a figure like Paul Gauguin, a painter who produces the most astonishing images which are found in galleries around the world to this day, and yet a very restless, unintegrated figure at the same time. There were many deceptions particularly involved in his depiction of the South Seas, which were idealised in his paintings and very little like what he showed us. But he had access to archetypal inspiration. He had access to an astonishing range of symbolism and depth in his art. Asymmetrical integration, which puts an emphasis on integration of belief at the expense of desire and meaning, can perhaps be illustrated by the lives of many philosophers. These are much more likely to have examined their beliefs, probably more than any other type of person. However, they may not be terribly integrated at a more everyday level or at a level of what you might call emotive or emotional integration. Within integration of belief, there's an inner left brain kind of consistency within a cognitive model, as well as a wider awareness between cognitive models mediated by the right hemisphere of the brain. This again can be illustrated in philosophy by the gap between a more analytic model of philosophy, where cognitive consistency is at a premium, and a more synthetic model of philosophy, where wider awareness, openness to different cognitive models and different metaphors becomes much more important. As well as between types of integration, there can be important asymmetries between levels of integration, that is, between the socio-political level and the individual psychological level. A society can be integrated in the sense that its governmental system and its social system work pretty well. There's very relatively little conflict in the public sphere, and yet individuals may be relatively riddled by psychological conflict. Or it may work the other way round. The public space may be chaotic, but the individual, on the other hand, may be relatively integrated and harmonious. In the modern world, especially in the Western world, a relatively high degree of socio-political integration has been achieved, certainly by comparison with the past. For example, levels of violence have consistently dropped, as documented in the book Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. However, this has been created by relatively high levels of specialization, which in turn tend to neglect individual integration and focus entirely on socio-political integration. Scientists, by working away in one small specialism and then pooling that knowledge and sharing it with the rest of society, contribute a great deal to our understanding of the world, and also to our understanding of what kinds of activities or what kinds of policies would lead to a more integrated society. That's been very successful in some ways, but it doesn't necessarily lead to integration at an individual level. But we need to recognise that all kinds of integration of judgment contribute to objectivity and contribute to us addressing conditions better. So that includes not just specialised scientific endeavour, which is largely recognised at a social level. It also includes individual integration. All of us, by addressing conditions in relation to all the different types of integration, can contribute towards a better world. We can do that by addressing conditions better in our entire emotional states, in our integration of meaning, as well as in our beliefs and the way in which we open our beliefs to more integrated, more adequate ways of thinking. A third kind of asymmetry of integration can occur between different objects, or perhaps most importantly, between different contexts where we meet different objects of things that we believe and interact with. A good example of this would be professional life versus personal life, perhaps the career versus the family. In these different spheres, we may operate in very different ways. A person who is a well-honed professional, ambitious, working very hard and effectively, well trained within their professional sphere, may be hopeless at personal relationships. Or there may be somebody who is excellent in their personal relationships but hasn't got on particularly well in the work sphere. This probably reflects asymmetrical degrees of integration of all the different types, perhaps desire, meaning and belief. Another example of contextual asymmetry of integration can be seen by looking at different political values and the divisions that exist in societies between different political communities. Let's take in the US the differences between Republicans and Democrats as vaguely defined broad communities of people. The work of Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, is very informative in this regard, because Haidt recognises different key values which are emphasised in the conservative or liberal communities of political interest. So conservatives are much more likely to emphasise values of authority, loyalty, purity, and perhaps freedom. Democrats or liberals, on the other hand, are much more likely to emphasise virtues of justice and care. So, in a way, all of these values do matter to all of us, but it's a question of how integrated our use of those values is, how integrated our application of them is in different contexts, because these values do, after all, address important conditions. One of the general effects of asymmetry of integration is hypocrisy. That's because we're very likely to have recognised a new condition theoretically, but not really worked out its full implications and not really be motivated to make changes in our lives to address that new condition. Our attitudes to environmental problems such as global warming are probably a very good indicator of this. Most of us these days will pay lip service to issues like this. Few of us are making an adequate response in the whole of our lives, an integrated response to such issues. Hypocrites often have opprobrium heaped on them, but hypocrisy is really a glass half empty, glass half full kind of situation. In many ways, being a hypocrite is much better than not being aware of an issue at all. We start off, in most cases, with at least an intellectual grasp of a new condition, and it takes time and practice and effort to actually make it part of our lives. So it's important not to be too impatient with asymmetrical integration. It's the condition of how we live. It's what it means to be a human being in many respects. We need to see it as a glass half full, not just as a glass half empty. One of the contexts where it's important to recognise asymmetrical integration is that of religion or spiritual leadership, or indeed to some extent any kind of leadership. It's very easy to idealise leaders, particularly those who we believe will solve our problems for us. And a very important part of that idealisation process is the assumption that a person is totally integrated. That involves blind spots to their asymmetries. But almost inevitably, religious or spiritual leaders will be asymmetrical in their degree of progress. They will not be enlightened in the sense of fully integrated in a balanced way in every respect. They're much more likely to have responded to the conditions of their life by developing in some ways much more than in others. The opposite response, though, to idealisation of leaders of any kind is dismissal. Again, we should expect all our leaders, particularly our political ones, to be asymmetrical in their degree of integration. They will have some strengths. They will be addressing conditions in some important respects. And there'll be other areas where they're not, and where they need our criticism, and where they need public debate to hold them to account. But it's pretty fruitless simply to pour scorn on politicians as a whole, and to assume that they're all bad just because they're inconsistent. To summarise, then, the integration of our judgments varies, meaning that the integration of a person is usually asymmetrical or inconsistent. The value of specialisation in our society always needs to be weighed against that of synthesis, where we bring ideas together. We need to see the big picture in order to integrate. We can be asymmetrical in terms of types, such as desire, meaning and belief, between levels, such as socio-political and individual levels of integration, or between different contexts, as for example the public context as opposed to the private life one. Asymmetry of integration often creates hypocrisy, but you can see hypocrisy either positively or negatively. It's a sign of progress, not just something to be blamed. We need to avoid either idealising or dismissing a person's integration, but rather recognise its incrementality. That is, that our integration is a matter of degree, and because we're human, it's going to be lopsided.